What was Pakistan's agenda for Afghanistan?
ما از ملت پاکستان که در طول دوران جهاد مردم ما را و جهاد ما را کمک و همکاری کردن یک عالم سپاسگزار هستیم. مگر این نقطه را فراموش کرده نمیتونیم که بعضی از سازمان ها در داخل پاکستان، مخصوصا ISI در داخل پاکستان، پروگرام های به خصوصی را در قسمت افغانستان طرح داشت و تعقیب کرد که او پروگرام ها قسمی که امروز میبینیم نه به نفع اسلام بوده، نه به نفع ملت افغانستان بوده و نه به نفع ملت پاکستان بوده. و من یقین دارم پروگرام ها و طرحهایی را که ISI داشت و تعقیب میکرد اکثریت سیاستمدارای دورفکر پاکستان و ملت پاکستان با او پروگرام ها مخالف بوده و مخالف است.
We in Afghanistan are very much grateful of the nation of Pakistan during our jihad against the Soviets. We are grateful of Pakistan's nation's help. We cannot forget it. Also, we cannot forget that the ISI, Intelligence Service of Pakistan, had its special agenda, which resulted in what we see today. This program or agenda of ISI was neither in the benefit of Islam nor nation of Afghanistan and not in the benefit of the nation of Pakistan. And I know also that most or majority of the statesmen in Pakistan were not happy with the agenda of ISI.
ISI was like a state within a state running loose, in other words then. Does he agree with that?
میگه شما به یقین هستین که آیسای خودش یک حکومت بود در مابین یک حکومت که لجام گسیخته بود و او که جلوگیری کرد نمیتونه.
بدون شک.
No doubt.
And creating Gulbuddin Hekmatyar in the process.
و میگه گلبدین حکمتیار در جریان به وجود آمد. محصول همه تو یک چیز است.
گلبدین حکمتیار محصول فعالیت‌های ISI در افغانستان و عامل ISI در داخل افغانستان بوده و است.
Gulbuddin Hekmatyar is the result or the product of the ISI's activities in Afghanistan and the real agent of ISI. He was and still he is.
From your perspective, did the Americans, either the American Foreign Ministry or the CIA, understand this hidden ISI agenda for Afghanistan?
فکر میکنید که امریکایی ها و مثلا CIA هم بود همینطور یک برنامه مخفی ISI در وقت میفهمیدن یا نه؟
ما فکر میکنیم که طریق از دری قسمت تا حد زیادی میفهمیدن و ISI به امریکایی ها همیشه مثلا مطلب انتقال داده بود و فهمانده بود که یگانه شخصیتی که در آینده در افغانستان به قدرت برسه دیگه او حکمتیار است و حزبی که منظم است حکمتیار است، شخصیتی که در آینده در افغانستان به قدرت برسه حکمتیار است.
I think that to a large extent they accepted that idea. To a large extent they were informed about. It was ISI who informed the Americans, correctly or not correctly, that it is the only organized party in Afghanistan. It's the only strong man who will take power in Afghanistan in the future. I think to that extent Americans knew it.
In 1978, Nur Muhammad Taraki, Hafizul Amin, and Babrak Karmal would begin the transformation of Afghanistan by bringing in the communist ideology, which would have a lasting effect on the country to the present day. It began with the assassination of a respected and prominent leftist, Mir Akbar Khyber, who was the leader of the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, in short, the PDPA. His untimely death was placed at the feet of Afghanistan President Mohammed Daoud Khan. Just a year prior, Khan had met with the Soviet Union's President Leonid Brezhnev to discuss bringing together the Afghan communist parties, which were the Parcham and the Khalq, Both were factions of the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan. Brezhnev considered this an important time for both the Soviets and the Afghans. A power play was beginning, and the Soviets knew that the roads of the Middle East oil was through the largest country in the Asian Afghanistan provinces. However, Daoud Khan was a revisionist for the country. He saw how Great Britain and its ally, the United States, began internally usurping other Arab nationalist countries with newfound vigor. Daoud bluntly replied that Afghanistan would remain free and not under any foreign occupation. Daoud Khan would return to his home country and began the process of eliminating any future contacts with the Soviets, and instead wished to begin new relations with its Eastern Arab nations, Saudi Arabia, and began dialogue with King Khalid bin Abdulaziz Al Saud regarding the regulation of oil to the Arabs only. Months later, the assassination of Khyber took place, leading the communist bloc to stage rallying point against the Nationalist Party. Khan, shocked by what he considered treason within the country's government, ordered the arrest of the PDPA leaders Taraki, Ayman, and Karmal. However, his response to these arrests were not met with immediate action. A coup d'etat was underway, and the Daoud loyalists who surrounded his home were outmatched by the PDPA armies. Daoud and his family were met with a hail of gunfire, and all were killed on the night of April 27, 1978. The government announced on radio that Daoud would leave the country and his presidency due to health reasons. This event in time was called the Sour Revolution. A cable from the United States addressed the immediate threat to the region, that the communist bloc of the PDPA was most likely backed by the Soviet Union. Many of the Afghans in the north capital of Kabul welcomed the new government led by the leaders of the PDPA, as they found Daoud Khan strict against the non-Pashtuns minority and its religious sector. The leadership of Afghanistan would construct as this: Taraki as prime minister, Karmal as senior deputy prime minister, and Hafizul Amin as foreign minister. Those who would initially welcome the PDPA, however, would suddenly become to regret this decision. Taraki would begin implementing land reforms and also a more liberal transformation for women. Voting and dressing in westernized clothing, for example, were highly encouraged. Suddenly, the traditionalist Afghans and its Pashtuns would realize that the socialist ideology was beginning to take an incremental hold of the country, starting in Kabul, the capital. Tribal traditions were now banned, such as usury, bride price, and forced marriages. Education was now at the forefront. Literacy was also improving, while beards on men were discouraged. The religious sector of Afghanistan took immediate notice, and their displeasure was loudly declared. They wanted a new government. Meanwhile, the Pakistan ISI were watching very closely under Hamid Gul, who was the president, watching the country make a miraculous turn. However, the Soviets and the communist bloc threatened Pakistan as well. Also, Hamid Gul had thought, as well as Zia-ul-Haq. Marxist policies were replaced Afghan traditions. The Pashtuns protested. It would be met with extreme prejudice by the PDPA as the military wing began to arrest and even torture local tribe and Afghans who were voicing their opinions too broadly. Some were even assassinated in the silence of the night. However, a new coup was beginning to take place, and on September 11, 1979, Taraki, who was returning from a meeting in Cuba, was greeted by Amin at the airport. Amin had accused Taraki of being incompetent to govern the country and had him arrested. After Taraki's arrest, Amin reportedly discussed the incident with Leonid Brezhnev, in which he said, "Taraki is still around. What should I do with him?" The response from the Soviet leader was quite curt: "Do what you will." Amin was adamant about expelling Taraki from the country, but the Soviets favored Taraki more than they did Amin. On September 15, 1979, the Soviet battalion located at Bagram Air Force Base was put on notice to try and rescue the imprisoned Taraki. But Amin loyalists had the manpower advantage. They stood down for now. The next day, the Politburo of the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, the PDPA, declared Amin as the new general secretary. Amin ordered the death of Taraki during the evening hours of October 8, 1979, and arrogantly believed he had the full support of the Soviets in doing so. However, Brezhnev heard about the murder of Taraki and was enraged at the outcome. Amin had also arrested the family of Taraki and jailed them immediately after his death. Almost immediately, Amin's government began to invest in the reconstruction and reparation of mosques and catered to the tribal Afghans and its non-Pashtuns minority. The Afghan military plunged. Funding began to go to the local sector as well as the private sector immediately took notice. So did the Soviets. Amin placed blame of mass executions in 1977 through 79 on the Taraki-led government and began instituting Quranic scripture in his future speeches. He began to be seen as a pious Muslim to the public at large. Amin's enemies from the socialist bloc of the Taraki government, exiled in the Soviet Union, began plotting against him as well. Meanwhile, the Pakistan government began supporting him. An old ally, Babrak Karmal, began meeting with the Taraki loyalists. The meetings would be held in the southern tip of the Soviet Union, and these talks would prove to be beneficial to the communist bloc. December 1979, Amin would meet with Agha Shahi, Pakistan's foreign minister. These meetings would embark on how to defend against future coups from the Taraki loyalists and the communist bloc. Through the Pakistan ISI and the Pakistan Secret Police, they would begin training Mujahadeen rebels in Jalalabad, Pakistan. Hafizullah Amin would begin to grow suspicious of everyone and relocated to his home in the center of Kabul. The conspiracies, which began with Soviet spies, began troubling Amin as a trouble agent for the United States. Many Afghans began to doubt the current leadership, and the Soviets began to implement a coup against Amin. And on 1979, December 27th, Soviet military troops stormed Amin's guarded palace and killed him. His son was also mortally wounded in the gunfire. Amin, even at the point of adjunct telling him it was the Soviets committing the coup, he didn't believe it. The men of Amin's family were all executed, while the women, including his daughter, were imprisoned. Immediately after his death, Radio Kabul played the pre-recorded speech of one of his one-time ally from the PDPA, Babrak Karmal. Today, the torture machine of Amin has been smashed. Karmal was installed by the Soviets as the new president, and Karmal promised an end to all executions, the establishment of the democratic institutions and free elections, the creation of a constitution, and legalization of alternative political parties. All Amin loyalists were arrested, while many were executed. Karmal knew he had to win over the favor of the distrustful Afghan people. The Soviets protested, and Karmal replied, "As long as you keep my hands bound and do not let me deal with the Khalq faction, there will be no unity in the PDPA, and the government cannot become strong. They tortured and killed us. They still hate us. They are the enemies of the party." The Khalq faction from the PDPA was removed from power, and only technocrats and individuals within the Soviet Union trusted would be appointed to the highest echelons of government. Karmal tried to implement policies which many in the Afghan populace saw as an invasion of secular ideology purported by the Soviet Union. The religious minorities, led by the non-Pashtuns and Afghan tribal leaders, saw once again an affront to the Islamic Sharia. January 1980, foreign ministers from 34 nations of the Islamic Conference adopted a resolution demanding the immediate, urgent, and unconditional withdrawal of Soviet troops from Afghanistan. The United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution protesting the Soviet intervention by a vote of 104 to 18, with the 18 abstentions. Immediately, the United States, CIA, and National Security Agency began covertly funding Afghan warlords, led by Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, the Hizb-e-Islami, and Abdul Rasul Sayyaf of the Northern Alliance in their fight against the Soviet occupation. Many other foreign agencies, such as the Pakistan ISI, the British MI6, and the Israeli Mossad, began funding the civil war. Pakistan would begin recruiting Muslims within the region to train a local military grounds. Seeing this was the war, the global jihad, most of the ultra-Orthodox sector was dreaming about. One notable individual began to take full advantage of the war. His name was Abdullah Yusuf Azam, a local imam and Pakistan Hafiz. Azam would begin to implement a new ideology, which was called offensive and defensive jihad. Azam's definition of offensive jihad refers to armed struggle against unbelievers in the classic definition from Islamic law. Azam's jihad definition also makes clear that no civilians would be harmed or killed during battle. His speeches and teachings would resonate throughout Pakistan's local madrasas. One student took notice. He was from Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, Osama bin Laden, who was also a Saudi student who actually went to some of Azam's classes while he taught in Saudi Arabia many years ago. They both began to construct a recruitment center, which would be the base of all training operations. The name of this would be the Maktab al-Khidmat, or Afghan Services Bureau, funded by not only Osama bin Laden through his family's company, the Saudi bin Laden Group, the CIA, Pakistan ISI, and MI6 also began funneling money through the Afghan Services Center through their centers in Arizona and New York. One such center was through the Al-Khifa Refugee Center in Brooklyn, New York. Next door was the Al-Faruq Mosque, which would later have members of it, which would bomb the World Trade Center in 1993. Bin Laden would also allow another individual to become a partner in the training center, someone who had long-standing ties to known Egyptian terrorist groups, such as the Egyptian Islamic Jihad. His name was Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri. Together, all three men would recruit local Afghans, as well as Arab Muslims from around the globe, to join the fight against the Soviet and atheist invaders. According to CIA Alex Station Director Michael Scheuer, the Afghan Services Bureau would approximately be funded to the tune of $600 million. The recruitment center would begin to expand to many areas inside the United States, with the very first base located in Arizona, as well as the biggest base, the Al-Khifa Refugee Center in Brooklyn, New York, as well as in Oklahoma, Florida, Detroit, Texas, Houston, Texas, and California in Los Angeles. The New York City Al-Khifa Refugee Center would be headed by al-Zawahiri's mentor and leader of the Gamma Islamiyah terrorist group, Omar Abdel Rahman, nicknamed the Blind Sheikh. Rahman would enter the United States while being restricted to a watch list, but his U.S. visa application would be approved multiple times by CIA agents within the Cairo U.S. Embassy Center. Meanwhile, as the war raged, many Afghan Muslims would start dying off in large numbers from Soviet helicopters. Many of those Afghans were nationalist tribal members who were not of any ultra-Orthodox sect. They would be replaced by the religious youth, or called the Mujahadeen, from the Pakistan madrasas from Jalalabad and Islamabad, using Azam's teachings as the guidelines. Ayman al-Zawahiri and Abdullah Azam would make frequent visits to the United States in such places as Oklahoma, Detroit, Arizona, and New York City, declaring the Soviets as the kuffar and endlessly recruiting hopeful jihadis to the war. Meanwhile, Hekmatyar, the leader of the Hizb al-Islami Party and Pakistan group, would be the most funded warlord in the war. His sect would begin using those funds, as well as the drug routes along the Afghan-China road, nicknamed Silk Road, to purchase weapons from the intelligence agencies, most notably the ISI and the CIA. Meanwhile, through a CIA operation called Operation Cyclone, the United States began funneling Stinger missiles to the local Afghans in hopes of turning the war in their favor. And by 1984, the missiles were having their effects. The Afghans began turning the tide in their favor, and the Carter administration, under National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski, would implement policies which would be echoed throughout U.S. foreign policy to the present day. It was called the Grand Chessboard. In particular, Brzezinski writes, "It is imperative that no Eurasian challenger would emerge capable of dominating Eurasia and thus also of challenging America's global dominance. However, there would be a new group that would take formation in U.S. foreign policy from the mid-90s and more prominent in the late 1990s and early 2000s. They would be the neoconservatives." The Soviets knew the war would be a losing proposition and determined not to suffer any more casualties. And by mid-1987, the Soviet Union, now under reformist leader Mikhail Gorbachev, announced it would start withdrawing its forces after meetings with the Afghan government, led by the Pakistan government, acting as a mediator. By 1989, all Soviet military had left the country. The casualties suffered in the war's end, with 14,500 Soviets killed, 90,000 Mujahadeen killed, and approximately 1.3 million Afghan civilians killed. The war made Osama bin Laden an overnight hero in the Muslim world, as he helped by building roads, bridges, and local recruitment centers during the 10 years. The Maktab al-Khidmat continued to be funded by Muslims and the CIA around the world. Meanwhile, Azam would confront both of his confidants, bin Laden and al-Zawahiri, about using the funds to help rebuild Afghanistan and turn their attention to the Palestinians in Israel. However, al-Zawahiri had other ideas. He wanted to use the operations funding to keep the jihad going, this time against the United States, who had left the country to its own self, and which would conduct 2 civil wars, which would have tripled the casualty rates of the Soviet-Afghan War. On November 24th, 1989, Abdul Azam, his son Mohammed, were driving his father and brother to prayers held in the mosque in Peshawar when unknown assailants detonated a roadside bomb as the vehicle approached the bridge, killing everyone in the car immediately. To this day, nobody was arrested for the murder, and according to certain close contacts of Azam, had placed blame on Egyptian cleric Ayman al-Zawahiri, as well as the Saudi GID and Israeli Mossad. Those same associates of Azam suspect the killing was part of a purge of those who favored moving the jihad to Palestine. One of them was the Al-Kifr Refugee Center Imam Mustafa Shalabi, who also agreed to continue the jihad in Palestine against the Zionist Jews. Shalabi would later be killed in his home in Brooklyn in 1991. His murder, much like Azam, was unsolved, with the main suspect was also another Egyptian cleric, Omar Abdel Rahman, left to take control of the Al-Kifr Refugee Center. Both al-Zawahiri and Rahman denied their involvement in the 2 murders, with the Maktab al-Khidmat now under the control of Ayman al-Zawahiri and Osama bin Laden, and the Al-Kifr Refugee Center, as well as the Al-Faruq Mosque, under the control of Omar Abdel Rahman. The operations center would continue its base under a new name, Al-Qaeda.